When I was in the seminary, we had a class that was entitled Pastoral Theology. It wasn't really so much about theology as it was practical pastoral advice from the rector, the head of the seminary. One of his lessons was on never being first in line to eat at a parish function. It was a practical reminder to live with humility as priest, who must not only lead, but serve. Humility is the central lesson of this weekend's sacred scriptures. The Old Testament book of Sirach, from late in the pre-Christian Jewish era, provides insight to that developed moral and spiritual teaching of Judaism before Jesus Christ. And the church's deliberate selection of this passage, commending humility, is a clear indication that the gospel lesson is about the virtue of humility as well. Now, looking at the gospel more closely, we note that the guests at the dinner were observing Jesus carefully, perhaps expecting him to act contrary to some common teaching or practice of the very people he was eating with. Jesus boldly directed his lesson at them. Although speaking of a wedding banquet in the parable and not an ordinary dinner party like the one they were at, the scribes and Pharisees knew he was talking about them. The lesson about not presuming to take the best place or a place of honor at a banquet was about more than table manners. It was about humility versus pride. In a similar way, our seminary rector's lesson was not about politeness as much it was about not presuming privilege in all things. The work of the priest necessarily places him in prominent places. I preach from a pulpit here. I lead the prayer of the congregation from a very visible place, and I'll stand at the altar in the elevated sanctuary. And often as a pastor, I had to stand in front of a group to speak or to teach or sometimes even just to listen. And at times I had to sit at some sort of head table. But I must not confuse the responsibilities of my office and the true purpose for why I must sometimes be visibly or audibly or practically in a position of prominence. I must always remember that I am placed in whatever position to serve God. And it is only from my dependence on him in the first place that I can be here at all. I can only be effective from my place if I maintain that sense of dependence on God. And I certainly need to watch out for any thinking that would exaggerate privileges attached to my responsibility and mission. I can be tempted to mislead myself and perhaps develop a wrong sense of importance in myself, rather than realizing that any importance comes from my faithful and responsible use of the gift that God has entrusted to me. The extreme result of a misguided sense of importance can lead to the delusion of self-sufficiency. I make enough mistakes to temper that, but I also know that there are areas of my life where I'd still like to be independent from rather than dependent on God. That was the real problem of the scribes and Pharisees. They were leaders and teachers, valuable and necessary for the Jewish community. However, for some, the real importance of the work degenerated into a kind of independence from God. It was fed by too much practical privilege. It was manifest in interpretations of law that seemed more aimed at solidifying their importance to the community rather than drawing people closer to God. We all need to be attentive to the fundamental importance of humility. It's the baseline. It's the virtue that says I can't really do it all on my own. I am dependent on God. After all, he made me in his image. He sent his Son to redeem me so that I could be assured of forgiveness of my sins. And indeed, in humility, I must seek that forgiveness often. He endowed me with natural and spiritual gifts which need constant nurturance from him. Humility does not eliminate the value of seeking to work and accomplish and be successful. Humility simply, or perhaps not so simply, has all our motivation for work, accomplishment, and success guided by and integrated with an alive and ongoing relationship with God in Jesus Christ. Humility before God means we do pray. We read and reflect on his revelation. We seek to know and understand the words of Jesus and the teaching of his church. We constantly examine and refine our lives according to that vision. It is the basis for the incentive and the power to be humble before others. And recognizing our dependency on God and our giftedness, we realize how much and how equally God loves and gifts all of those around us. And yes, authentic humility will work its way into all sorts of practical gestures of patience, charity, and deference to brothers and sisters, whether that be at the banquet or in the parking lot or the anonymity of the highway or the mall. Our culture ironically presents repeated examples of the errors of people making choices that don't seem to include faith in or dependence on God. Through pride, an integrated sense of authentic dependence on God for the best use of our human resources can become devalued. The false pride that displaces God can devolve into even a hostility toward God, as we were so tragically reminded this past week. So we who identify ourselves as believers in God best demonstrate and grow in humility through deliberate efforts to nurture that relationship to God with prayer and learning that will guide us in humble but effective and purposeful action. God gave us free will so that we could choose to do good. Free will enhances the value of our choices. It ennobles them. Unfortunately, that means we have the freedom to make evil choices. So all the more, we who freely choose God and his good must look for ways to draw others to choose God and his good as well.